Welcome to Little Known History. Today we're unraveling one of the most persistent myths in popular history, the so-called fall of Rome. You've probably heard that the Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, the moment when the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was overthrown by the barbarian Odacer. But here's the truth. Most historians don't buy that anymore. In fact, they don't even call it the fall of Rome. They call it what it really was, the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. And even that label is getting a second look. So, what really happened in the 5th century? Was it a cataclysm, a decline into chaos, or something much more complex? Something that challenges our basic assumptions about how empires end. In this video, we will explore how the idea of a sudden collapse was invented, why modern historians prefer the word transformation, and how a surprising comparison with Chinese dynasties reveals the power of narrative. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never think of Rome's fall the same way again. Let's start with what most of us were taught, that in 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire came crashing down. But this moment, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by Odacer wasn't seen as earth-shattering at the time. According to a 2021 article in Time magazine, this event wasn't even labeled a fall until decades later, when an Eastern Roman chronicler named Marcellinus Combs declared the Western Empire had perished. Why? Because Emperor Justinian needed a justification for his brutal reconquest of Italy. In other words, the story of a sudden collapse was retroactively created to serve political goals. What's more, Odacer didn't torch Rome or erase its institutions. He ruled as a kind of Roman stand-in, maintaining the Senate, using Roman laws, and even putting Eastern emperors' faces on coins. When Theoderic the Ostrogoth succeeded him in 493, he launched a building campaign in Ravenna that revived old Roman grandeur, public baths, aqueducts, and even the idea of Roman citizenship continued under Gothic rulers. As Time put it, rather than a fall, this was more like a management change. In fact, the real devastation came decades later, when Justinian launched his reconquest in 535. His armies devastated Italy in a long war that left cities depopulated and infrastructure in ruins. Rome's population may have dropped from 500,000 to under 30,000. That's what modern historians like Kyle Harper call a true crisis point. So, if we're looking for collapse, maybe it's not 476 we should be worried about, but the reconquest that followed. Now, let's dig deeper. Why have so many historians moved away from the word fall altogether? Because what really happened in the 5th and 6th centuries was a transformation, not an apocalypse. Roman culture did not vanish overnight. In many areas, especially in Gaul and Hispania, Roman law, language, and social structures continued well into the Middle Ages. The barbarian kings who took over didn't see themselves as destroyers of Rome, they saw themselves as successors to it. Henri Pirenne, a 20th century historian, argued that Roman continuity stretched until the rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, when Mediterranean trade routes were finally severed. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Pirenne's thesis shifted the focus away from barbarian invasions and toward economic isolation as the true end of classical civilization. Whether or not scholars today fully accept Pirenne's timeline, his broader point still holds. The transition from Rome to medieval Europe was gradual, not sudden. Modern scholarship supports this view. Historian Guy Halsall, writing in Barbarian Migrations and the Roman West, argues that so-called barbarian groups were often deeply Romanized before they even crossed the Rhine. They were familiar with Roman customs, trade networks, and diplomacy. The real shift wasn't cultural extinction. It was a rearrangement of power. Think of it this way. When a Fortune 500 company gets acquired, it doesn't vanish. Its logos change, its board reconfigures, but the workflows and infrastructure stay largely intact. That's the kind of fall we're talking about. Now for something a little different. Let's step back and ask, why is the fall of the Western Roman Empire treated as a singular catastrophe, while other civilizations, like China, are allowed to have rise and fall cycles without losing their identity? This is where the comparison gets fascinating. In Chinese history, the fall of a dynasty is considered a normal part of the cycle. The end of the Han didn't mean the end of China. When the Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming each came and went, historians treated them as parts of a broader continuous civilization. But in the case of Rome, we apply a double standard. The Roman state underwent enormous transformations long before 476 CE, from republic to principates, from the Severan dynasty to the dominants, from paganism to Christianity, and yet all of this is treated as a single arc. Only when the western half of the empire loses its central emperor do we draw a bright red line and say, that's the end. But why? Walter Scheidel, a historian at Stanford, raised this very point in his book, Escape from Rome. He argues that the fall wasn't just exaggerated, it was narratively necessary. In a 2019 Stanford News article, he explained that Rome's breakdown actually unlocked political experimentation in Western Europe. Without a single empire dominating the continent, smaller kingdoms and states began to compete, innovate, and evolve. According to Scheidel, if Rome hadn't fallen, the modern world as we know it might never have emerged. In that sense, calling it a fall might not just be misleading, it might be missing the whole point. So, what's the real takeaway here? The fall of the western half of the Roman Empire wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a politically useful narrative retrofitted to justify war, misunderstood by later historians, and only recently re examined as a transformation. Rome didn't vanish in 476. It evolved, fractured, and left behind a living legacy that shaped the medieval world. And when we compare this with how other civilizations like China frame regime changes, we realize something else. Sometimes how we tell history matters more than what actually happened. The fall of Rome isn't a moment, it's a myth. And it's time we told the story better. That'll be all for today. This is the Little Known History YouTube channel signing out. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and comment something positive.